died and gone to heaven. There was nothing quite as sinfully delicious as the treat Vermonters called sugar on snow. Hot maple syrup drizzled like lace onto a cup of fresh snow. She ducked under a maple tube, careful not to dislodge it from the tree. Was it too much to hope that the sugar house would, she smiled inwardly at the pun, sweeten the pill for Florence? Maple syrup was her daughter's one weakness, perhaps the only preference the two of them shared. And lately, they'd managed to get her diabetes under control, more or less. Enough for the odd cup of sugar on snow, anyway. She sighed as she zipped her fleece higher against the chill wind coming off the mountain. Florence remained adamantly opposed to the idea of a weekend cabin. "It's bad enough," she'd said furiously, "having to live in Hicksville when I could be in London, without being dragged off to some stupid cabin in the middle of nowhere with 3 disgusting brothers every weekend." And Harriet knew that no amount of maple syrup was going to change her daughter's mind. Sometimes she couldn't help feeling a little cheated. 4 children and only 1 girl. A daughter so unlike herself it was hard to believe they were related.
"I know the feeling,"
her mother Sophie had told her briskly when she'd ventured to raise the topic during her visit home to London the previous summer.
"If you hadn't been born at home, I'd have thought they'd switched you at the hospital. Look at your sisters. 2 in fashion and 1 in broadcasting, not a car between them, not one of them further away from us than SW6. And then there's you, half a world away, only happy when you're sorting out somebody's crisis. I swear the only time I ever saw you smile as a child was when we took you to Glastonbury and the tent collapsed and we all had to sleep outside in the open in the middle of a muddy field."
Florence didn't even look like Harriet. She took after Oliver, all glowing caramel skin and blonde health and vitality, with the same vivid blue eyes, whereas Harriet and the boys were pale and dark and slender. Harriet found it impossible to hold a meaningful conversation with her daughter. They simply didn't know what to say to each other. And it had nothing to do with her being a teenager, despite what Oliver said. Of course she took it personally. What mother wouldn't? The truth was, Harriet had never known what to say to her. In the beginning, when Florence, her first child, was born, and she'd struggled with the shock of motherhood and this tiny, screaming, red-faced package of demands, she'd thought her discomfort was just a question of it all being so new, so different, so completely unlike anything she'd done before. Even though Oliver had been just as new to it all, and yet seemed able to tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired one, as easily as separating apples from oranges. Then she'd got the hang of things and developed an efficient routine, telling herself anxiously that it was just as commendable to be a good mother as a natural one, whatever that was. But Florence had still looked at her with the distant, quizzical blue gaze of a stranger, clearly waiting for something Harriet simply hadn't known how to give. She loved her daughter, there was no question of that. She'd have walked over hot coals for Florence from the second she heard her first cry. But there was never any real connection between them. Right from the beginning, they were almost painfully polite with one another. Harriet would crouch down on the floor to play with the blocks Florence was building, and the little girl would simply stop what she was doing and wait patiently for her mother to finish before resuming on her own. But when Florence played with her father, she giggled and knocked over his tower and handed him bricks, which meant that the problem must be her fault. She obviously lacked some crucial maternal instinct. She'd failed at the most important thing she'd ever attempted, and she'd had no idea what to do to put it right. So she'd retreated into what she did know how to do. While Oliver had stayed at home and brainstormed ideas for Play-Doh and finger foods, she'd thrown herself back into work, using her PR skills to take their fledgling sandwich business so far so fast that America had quickly become their logical next step. And then she'd found herself pregnant again. It hadn't been planned, of course. Oliver had been very keen to have a second child, but privately she